Welcome to Live at the League. I'm Emily Kalashevsky, Assistant Director of Member Experience and Learning here. And there has been a lot happening over the past couple of weeks. So today we're bringing you the latest updates and what they mean for Michigan communities. Here's what we'll be covering: a look at the recently completed state budget, legislation that made it across the finish line before the legislature adjourned, and Governor Whitmer's recent vetoes. The next phase of Michigan's statewide housing plan, including opportunities for local officials to help shape the plan and learn more about Opportunity Zones 2.0, and a few league reminders and upcoming opportunities you won't want to miss. If you're watching live, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or Q&A box. We'll answer as many as we can throughout the show. With that, we're going to dive right in. John, let's start with the biggest news. After a marathon session, the legislature finalized the state budget. What should local officials know about where things landed, and what does this budget mean for Michigan communities?
Yeah, no, thanks, Emily, for the question. And yeah, it was quite the interesting process.
Mhm.
And we just got done actually talking to staff about this a little bit, and I mentioned it gets more and more interesting every single year. And for a variety of different reasons, some good, maybe even some not so good. But it is the process that we've been dealing with. But just to sort of set the groundwork for how we got to here, there was a big push by the legislature, as there should be, to try to get the budget done by June 30th to meet the statutory deadline. They actually went by that deadline by a couple of days, and late into the night on July 2nd and early into the morning, actually all the way up to about 9 a.m. on July 3rd before they finally wrapped it up. And interesting this year compared to previous years, and I know Dave's going to talk about this here in a few minutes, is that several, and by several, I mean really dozens of policy bills got attached to this budget as part of the negotiation at the end of the day. And so while we typically have a good idea of what's going on, knowing full well that people are going to get behind closed doors and make decisions at the end of the day that you hope you've done enough work to navigate and influence, the fact that they put several policy bills in place, not knowing exactly what they were, or what that meant in terms of any changes or new additions and things like that, just made that process a little bit more nerve-wracking. Excuse me. At the end of the day, though, what I would say is the budget itself was pretty baseline. Not a lot of new. They were dealing with $1 billion deficit, and they've actually had to make some cuts to programs that have been long-standing programs over the course of really, decade plus now. Things like Pure Michigan funding was cut in half, and a few other programs that were out there, all to deal with the impacts of the one big beautiful bill, quite frankly. And there were also priorities, right? The speaker had his priorities of having a budget that was less than what last year's was, making sure that there were no new taxes in that budget and that they didn't tap the state's rainy day fund. All three of those goals were accomplished by the speaker. And so, working within that framework, the negotiators and the leadership was able to come to a budget that on paper looks to be just over $75 billion. There are some federal funds held outside of that, just a little over 9 billion specifically dealing with Medicaid that pushes that budget closer to about 85 billion, but that's still less than the top line dollar amount from last year. For local units of government, understanding that it was a tight budget year, we had a couple of key objectives. One, that was to make sure statutory revenue sharing was not cut at all, and then the advocacy to push for the revenue sharing trust fund. We were able to successfully accomplish that first one. There were no cuts to statutory revenue sharing this year. And to the best of our knowledge, the revenue sharing trust fund was on the table till late in the game, but there was no agreement on that ultimately in the policy bills that passed. So our advocacy is going to have to continue on that front. But I would remind everyone that we have received unanimous support in the Senate this year. So there's still an option and an opportunity for us to talk about that going forward. On the constitutional revenue sharing side, and just for everybody's knowledge, constitutional revenue sharing is something we don't control as
Mhm.
part of our legislative process. It is a constitutionally specific formula that gives cities, villages, and townships 15% of the revenue generated off to 4% of the state sales tax. And so that number is actually down slightly this year. And there are two reasons for that. Even though COVID does seem like it was some time ago, some of that purchasing that happened over the COVID time period is starting to flatten out and return more to normal. And then we're still dealing with the second sort of I don't want to say iteration, but like the second implementation phase would be the way in which to describe it of the transportation funding proposal that passed last year. So constitutional revenue sharing is down about $9.5 million. And so you will see once Treasury does come out with projections, and they have not yet, your overall number may be down about 1.5% or 2%. That's all due to the change. And constitutional has nothing to do with a reduction in statutory because that was held flat this year. So again, nothing truly exciting to report, but in a very, very difficult year for the legislature to make some very difficult decisions on cuts and reauthorization of current funds, we were able to maintain our status, particularly on the statutory side. So we're happy about that.
Thanks, John. Like you talked about, a lot more than just the budget moved before lawmakers wrapped up their work. Dave, can you highlight, let's talk specifically about some of the legislation that passed during those final hours that municipalities should have on their radar?
Yeah, as John mentioned, there were actually close to 60, I believe, bills that passed as part of this overall negotiation process. Some of them we were monitoring quite closely. Others we were happy to hear did not actually make it through, including some of that bad housing legislation that we had been monitoring for quite some time now. But this is really part of the overall negotiation process. In fact, earlier in the day, we had actually heard that there was a deal struck on the budget and that they were moving forward with that. And it was really these policy items that was bogging everything down. But some of the things that did make it through, we were very supportive of. Obviously, things like sunset extensions for the commercial redevelopment stuff, low income housing tax credits. And, Jen's been very active in the single stairway legislation for multiple dwellings under certain conditions. That's all stuff that passed. There were some things that we had testified in concern of, including paid military leave for certain members of fire department and law enforcement agencies, just because of the budgeting aspect of that and not really being able to prepare. We were able to get some language in that clarified exactly what it means to have days off and things like that. So all in all, a lot of legislation flew through at the last minute that we were tracking. But that's just kind of how things go with the budget process in terms of negotiating and being able to get those done and across the finish line.
Absolutely. And some of the other discussion, as part of all of this, is that Governor Whitmer also issued several vetoes last week. So, Dave, can you
Yeah.
walk us through what was vetoed and whether any of those decisions have implications for local governments?
Yeah, so I think I'll take us back to really where it all started, if you'll give me a little bit of a latitude on that since it's been a while.
Yeah,
But
of
so
course.
so the court, so this all stemmed from a court battle where Speaker Matt Hall's decision in January of 2025 to halt the presentation or processing, if you will, of 9 bills specifically during the that were passed during the 2024 lame duck session. And so generally speaking, no future legislature is bound by the decisions of a current legislature. So that's traditionally been interpreted to mean that if a law is passed, obviously that law can be amended or repealed by a future legislature. Republicans took control of the House last election. Rep. Hall was elected as Speaker, and these 9 bills were still waiting to be presented to the governor. He took an interesting step once he became the speaker and argued that the 103rd legislature, or the current legislature that we are in, has no constitutional obligation to even transmit those bills that were already approved by the previous legislature, and that courts lack authority to actually require the House to do that. Um, so these are bills that, again, keep in mind, were passed by both the House and the Senate last session, and we're just waiting for what has essentially always been considered automatic, for lack of a better term, in terms of being presented. It's really a procedural technicality. But the now Speaker Matt Hall said not so fast, and he prohibited the current clerk of the House from presenting those bills to the governor, which would be the final step in that legislative process. And so that kicked off an 18-month legal battle on whether or not he actually had to do that. And that question was answered this past Friday by the Michigan Supreme Court, after a few rounds of back and forth in the circuit court and appeals, all of which ultimately ended up to be a moot point because the 9 bills were then vetoed by the governor just a few hours after that ruling on Friday. So her rationale is that to allow these bills to now become law a year and a half later would invite more litigation. It would be an administrative nightmare because there are specific dates and benchmarks that needed to be met from the language within those bills, and that accounting for some of those financial obligations within the state budget, a few of which have now passed since then, just would not be possible. So that's a pretty high level recap of the legal limbo aspect of those bills.
Mhm.
Specifically, some of the bills that passed dealt with bringing corrections officers into the state pension fold. The one that specifically impacted our members is House Bill 6058, and that would have made significant changes to the Publicly Funded Health Contribution Act, or PA 152.
Right.
So the changes that would have been made there specifically pertain to the 80/20 contribution and the way that the hard cap was approached. And then some of the protections that had been built into the existing law for local units of government during those negotiating processes were completely eliminated. For the 80/20 change, that really flipped it over entirely, making the minimum benefit contribution that a local government would have to make going forward would be 80%. So in other words, it took the ceiling and made it the floor. And
Mhm.
then that hard cap formulary, there were some changes on how that would be approached as well, which I think actually had some good intent, but the language that ultimately went through missed the mark, in my opinion. So we testified way back a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, on this in opposition. We testified to our members' concerns, and some changes were actually made for the better during the legislative process. But late in the night slash early morning during lame duck, that language was substituted out. And so that kind of set off a little bit of a fire drill for us, trying to get some better changes in or to just have it killed altogether. Ultimately,
Mm.
when it went through both the House and the Senate, we did write a veto letter requesting that Governor Whitmer veto the legislation. Her staff had reached out to us for some meetings to better understand those concerns, and we were working through some of that. And then that's when all of the legal stuff started to kick off. So 18 months later, we're happy to see that at least that particular bill has been ultimately vetoed, which is what we wanted to happen. But I will say, I don't think that this fight is over. It's going to depend on what the legislature actually looks like next session in terms of whether or not Republicans retain the House or if we have another Dem trifecta. If that's the case, Dem trifecta, I think we're going to have another fight on our hands and trying to maybe mitigate some of the things that this final bill looked like going forward.
Thanks so much, Dave. Appreciate that update. Jen, I want to shift to housing. Michigan is beginning work on the next statewide housing plan. Why is this update important, and how can local leaders participate in the engagement process and help shape that plan?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So, we're just wrapping up that first statewide housing plan that Michigan's ever had. And so now there's the opportunity, like you just said, to engage. It's really important that stakeholders are engaging in this time while MSHDA has a survey out right now that's live until I believe it's August 21st. We'll have a blog later out where you can directly click on that link and get to that Survey Monkey. But they're also traveling the state. They have their 15 regional housing partnership. They're broken down the state into 15 different regions. And so from April through July, MSHDA is traveling through and meeting with folks to talk about housing. The updated plan really is looking to be more focused than the first plan. Make sure there's a lot of data behind it and what they've learned these last 5+ years, and then making sure that the measurables, that the plan is going to have measurables and can be tracked. So, very transparent, and folks can kind of watch through a dashboard and see how the state's coming along on those goals and objectives once they are finalized.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate
Yeah.
that update. All right. Well, shifting to another housing and economic development topic that's generating a lot of interest is Opportunity Zones 2.0. Can you explain what's changed, why communities should pay attention, and how they can get involved in the upcoming regional stakeholder meetings?
Yeah, so there is a blog. I think Betsy's going to drop that into the chat here. So opportunity zones were reauthorized at the federal level a few months ago. And so right now the states are going through and identifying those zones. They are done by census tract. And MEDC is actually the lead on this stakeholder gathering of input. And so there are a number of dates where they are in the regions talking to folks involved in economic development and in housing, as well as one meeting that will be virtually that anybody statewide you can get involved in. And so we want to make sure that, again, folks are taking the opportunity to provide comment, ask questions while it's out there and help make that going forward, hopefully lead to some successful projects here in the future.
Absolutely. And again, that link for the blog is posted in the chat for folks who want to find out information. Before we wrap up, are there any other important updates, deadlines, or issues any of our team will be watching over the next few weeks?
Yeah, Emily, I just wanted to mention, so with the plethora of bills that passed during the budget, we did see Senate Bill 721 and 722 get done, which was the reauthorization of PA 255, the redevelopment, the commercial redevelopment, as well as PA 210, the commercial rehabilitation acts. Those extended the sunset through 2035, as well as had a couple of other technical changes that Treasury was looking for. Now, while those have passed and been ordered and rolled, that's as far as it's gone. So right before the 4th of July holiday, those were ordered and rolled. So they still have to be presented to the governor and get signed. But we take that as a great step that those got done across the finish line, at least as far as they can get at this point. And then we also saw on Friday at the federal level the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. That had overwhelmingly passed Congress and bipartisan. This is huge housing policy that is the first in decades to be done at the federal level. Unlike Michigan, when the chief in charge doesn't sign something, instead of it being a pocket veto, goes 10 days once it's presented to become law. So on Friday, just this past Friday, we did see the 21st Century Road to Housing Act become law. And we'll be getting more information out there. But really, overall, to know is that the Road to Housing Act is really a federal or a national model, very much aligned with what we are pushing here with the My Home program. It's about partnership. It's about providing technical assistance to locals to update their planning and zoning around housing. It is a carrot versus a stick when it comes to that zoning reform. And again, very much focused on working in partnership together to address the housing crisis. The feds are really staying in their own lane, deregulating what they control. Versus, trying to go after what states and locals do. They are just saying you need to be pro-housing, and if you're not, then you could lose access to existing programming. And so we'll have some more at that as things get moving here along again. But expect, I would say, there will be some webinars out there. Even if we are not personally doing that, we'll be sharing information nationally and other partners as they do them.
Thanks so much, Jen. John, what do you have?
Yeah, I mean, Jen nailed it, right? I mean, the things that have happened at the federal level are huge in terms of our advocacy here in Michigan as it relates to housing and how we take that and those aspects of the federal program and coordinate our efforts here in the state is going to be incredibly important. And we believe we have a plan that is on the table now that will best align us with those federal priorities. And that becomes incredibly important to our advocacy efforts as we deal with preemption. Right now, it was a big test for us walking into the budget, and especially when they begin to add bills to that negotiation to hold those off. But we are a long ways away from this session being over. We have nearly 6 full months before the end of the year. We're going to need to continue to make sure we align our priorities with other priorities that are out there or other programs that are out there, particularly in this case with the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. So we're extremely excited that that passed. Honestly, I'd be remiss if we didn't shout out the National League of Cities and their efforts. I know many of our members are also members of the National League of Cities. You know, with us being here in Michigan, they're really on the front lines many times on behalf of us and several other state leagues across the country, pushing for policy like this. And we provide them as much support as we possibly can, talking with our congressional delegation and things like that. But they did an amazing job in their efforts to really secure, as Jen had said, you know, one of the largest pieces of housing policy in the past several decades, which is going to be incredibly important to the concerns that we face here and that our communities face here in Michigan as it relates to that issue. And then I would just say, you know, there's always a question after the budget of what's next. And I kind of led off by talking about how things are different than they've been in previous years and continue to change, which is just fine. I mean, our job is to deal with that, to understand those dynamics and go from there. But I think part of the reason we saw so many pieces of legislation pass is that there is going to be a lack of activity, accustomed to other years potentially, not just between now and the election, but even potentially post-election, depending on how that works out. So it will be critical for us to focus on some of those key priorities that we have, and then also recognize where some of the challenges with policy that we have out there that we may want to hold off. And so it'll be an interesting few months, as it always is. But the dynamics of the budget this year, coupled with significant policy changes with those 60 plus bills that passed, really sets the legislature up to focus more on the election than it does on additional policy. We'll have to figure out if that actually plays out, and then also how to navigate it based on both our priorities and our concerns. So stay tuned for more on that. Lots of good things happening still, lots of things that we have in the pipeline that are going to be proactive coming forward, and things that we're working on, and then always trying to plan and prepare for that next legislative session. So you hear more from us on that as we move forward, coming into convention and other events that we have to spend time with you at.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for that, John. As always, we appreciate the entire state and federal affairs team for keeping our members informed on all of these issues. Before we wrap up today, a few quick reminders for everyone. Convention registration opens today. We'll be in Traverse City October 7th through 9th, and we hope we'll see you there. You can register right now in the league portal. So you'll want to go to my.mml.org to do that. And the formal registration link will be available later today as well on the formal convention website. You can also expect to get a couple of emails from us with those announcements. But if you need anything, you can always reach out. And of course, our online learning platform is available for you anytime. So if you need training between our major events, we've got training on topics like ethics, lobbying, local government finance, and more, all on our online learning platform. So you can learn there at your own pace 24/7. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Live with the League. Have a great week.